All right. So, Unit 10 for Introduction to the Humanities. This is a really complicated and interesting unit. In Unit 10, we start to see the a lot of political, philosophical, and social influences are very contemporary, or at least the histories here are very contemporary to our modern day era. And so this is where things we can start to relate a lot more of the content in this course directly to who we are today. And so this chapter talks about the changing medieval power structures throughout Europe. But in some of the video links, the crash course video links in there talk about what's going on during this entire period. But what I'm really interested in talking about today is specifically the influence that was occurring in England. And the reason that I want to focus on England and the British Isles in this particular lecture is because a lot of what was going on starting around 500, it was even in the 400s, but when the fall of the Roman Empire occurred, England started to gain its own identity. And in the gaining of its own identity, it starts to shape who we are today. Because as you all know, American culture is most prominently influenced, historically speaking, by the British Empire and specifically the English. So that's why we're going to go into looking at how these changes that were occurring in Europe and throughout the Mediterranean start to really influence our contemporary culture today. So the first thing I want to say is that, do you remember that early lecture that we talked about? I think it was a flip grid where we look at buildings of a particular era in history. And based on the buildings and the architecture from that era, we can start to determine what type of cultural values and situational, economic, political values shaped that period of time. And if you look at medieval Europe, which some people will refer to as the Dark Ages, which we'll get to in a second, but during this time period, castles became the predominant form of the most expensive and the most developed architecture, and that tells you something. And so, if we reflect on that, what does it tell you? I mean, what is a castle built for? The castle is built for, if we look here at the moat, it's built for defense primarily. It is almost always a defense mechanism. And so when we look at this time period and we look at how much effort they put into defense, it was obviously a pretty rough time politically, socially, and the bands, the competing power bands of people out there were consistently killing each other. And during the medieval period, as is pointed out in the crash course, it's usually in small scale instances because the collapse of the political structure. But we need to work our way back and say, okay, how did medieval or Dark Ages England and most of Europe end up there? And that's what the kind of path we're going to go on. And then we're going to talk about the implications. So this lecture might be a little bit of a longer one, but I'll try to move through it as quickly as I can. So fall of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire falls in England in the 400s, but I'm just going to say roughly 500. It's a real easy number to remember. 500 AD. And I know in the previous units we've already discussed this, but the Roman Empire falls. And then we need to look at what happens after that. So the Roman Empire was very centralized. It was very powerful. It was very effective at maintaining rule throughout this incredibly large kingdom. But as that centralized power starts to crumble, first in the periphery, and then it'll take about 100 years for it to move into the center and into Rome. During that time period, we are going into a dark period. And what does that mean? When we go into a dark period, it means that there is a loss of learning. There is a loss of knowledge. And so the things that the Romans, building their civilization largely upon the Greek knowledge, when the Roman Empire falls, we will not see in Europe specifically. This is excluding the Middle East. The Middle East was not going. In fact, the Middle East was going through a very successful technological uptick, but the European stage was going to see a loss of a lot of things, a loss of literacy, a loss of effective economics, a loss of engineering, a loss of mathematics, a loss of education. And those things are going to last for about 1,000 years. And so it's really not going to be until the at least in Italy in the 1300s, when we see the Renaissance occurring into England and into Northern Europe, it's going to be more into the 1500s before we see a really effective resurgence of the type of knowledge that the Roman Empire was capable of being reproduced in Europe. 1,000 years. And during that 1,000 years, it's not real pretty. Now, is that to say everything about the medieval period of the Dark Ages was terrible? No. There's a lot of really interesting things happening. There's little islands of knowledge. There's little islands of learning, of architectural development. We get the building of the cathedrals, which is, one of the most impressive feats coming out of this era that we're going to talk about in future units. Really impressive things. But again, we have to put it, if we're going to put it on a scale, it still pales in comparison to what was going on during the Roman Empire as far as knowledge, learning, transportation, economics, centralized coordination, all of those things. And that's why historically people have often referred to it as the Dark Ages. And England will be hit particularly hard. They will be one of the first geographies that will lose Roman influence, and then they will be one of the last to regain it. And since we gain so much of our cultural context and our cultural history from England, it's pretty imperative that we understand how these things fit together. So what I like to refer to this period as is the Dark Ages is basically like a giant biker gang, or many different groups of biker gangs take over Europe for 1,000 years. And if you compare biker gangs and the culture of bikers to the culture of medieval knights, it's different, but there's a lot of parallel and a lot of overlap. There's a strong code of honor. There's a strong code of brotherhood. There's violence is often at the center of that coordination and that structure, and loyalty to the group and to the clan goes above and beyond loyalty to any other concept or idea. And so we have the biker gang period of history. And so changing political power structures from the fall of the Roman Empire into what we're going to be moving into a feudal system is going to become the predominant force. And so here we're going to see Arthurian legends. We all know King Arthur and his court, his Knights of the Round Table. Beowulf. Some of you have probably read this in your past, which is really an Anglo-Saxon tale about a monster, the slaying of a monster. We'll get into that in a few minutes here. And then the Song of Roland, which is Crusaders fighting the Muslims. And then in Spain, and moving out of Spain back into France is where this is going to take place. And then Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is a fascinating tale, mostly about the rules of courtly love. And so we'll talk about how do the rules of courtly love come into play and why are they significant. So let's dive in here. So the first thing that we see during this time period, if we go back to Beowulf and we look at Beowulf, and you take some time to read the story, I highly encourage you. Beowulf is a great read. And if you read the Seamus Heaney edition, it's a modernized version. He's an Irish translator. Fantastic version of Beowulf. And in Beowulf, it's basically about this main character, Beowulf, who is a retainer. And a retainer is someone who helps the king or the ruler retain their power. And so I often like to think of Vikings here. And the Anglo-Saxons were not exactly Vikings. They are more from Denmark, but they shared a lot of cultural perspective with what will be known as the Vikings just a little bit later in British history. But basically, if you take a look at a map of England, when we take a look at a map of England, we have let's go over here and take a map of let's take a look here at a map of Roman England. And when we take a look at this, you will see a few things were happening during this time period. The most important one was that we have Hadrian's Wall, which some folks are familiar with Hadrian's Wall. I'm not sure if this particular image, maybe here. We can look at this one. This one might work. Okay, so this is Europe during the Roman Empire, and this is England up here, and this is where we have Hadrian's Wall. And when the Romans started to pull back because their empire was falling, they started to literally pack up and leave, or at least the money started to pack up and leave. Because as you know, the Romans often left their soldiers in country to become kind of pseudo lords, rulers, governors. Different places had different terms for it, but they would be the ruling class within conquered lands. And so they weren't able to conquer the north of England because the Celts were up there, but they were pretty successful at conquering and holding this, and they built Hadrian's Wall, which for any of you who've watched Game of Thrones, the concept of the North Wall is very much echoing the British history of Hadrian's Wall and keeping the barbarian Celts out of southern England. So when the Roman Empire, when the money starts to escape from England and head back, and the troops are no longer coming, and the support from Rome is no longer coming, the Roman elites who are living here, they said, okay, we need some soldiers. We're not getting any soldiers from Rome. What are we going to do? Well, what did they do? They hired mercenaries from Denmark and what will become northern Germany and the Netherlands. And these were the Anglo-Saxons and the Jutes. And they hired the Anglo-Saxons to come over, which, as you can see, the Vikings were up here in Scandinavia, and so held a lot of common cultural connections, seafaring people, very a warrior class people. And they hired them to come over and to fight for them. And as they were coming over and fighting for them, pretty soon the Anglo-Saxons said, you know what? These former Romans, they've got a nice land. They've got a pretty good place to live. They've got no soldiers. They've got fortifications. They've got roads. They've got no soldiers. And they're paying us to fight the Celts up here. Why don't we just kill all of them and then we can have England? And it was, of course, wasn't called England at the time, but that's basically what they did. And so this is where we have the Anglo-Saxons basically supplanting, in a large part, not entirely, but in a large part, supplanting the former Romans who had been occupying this land. And so then later on, ironically, we're going to have another party of Vikings come down and start to raid England. But during this time period, both the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings, who were starting to have more power as the Roman Empire collapsed, were very much, in most cases, they ruled with strongman politics. And so I want to make a pretty clear distinction between what I'm going to refer to here as strongman politics and hereditary monarchies. And so the difference is that a hereditary, so we could also put, we could also put the Angles and the Saxons. Strongman politics are very different from hereditary rule. In strongman politics, that if you are the king or the clan leader or the ruler of a particular group of people, you are that person because you probably killed the previous clan leader. You went to single one-on-one combat, or you assassinated them, or you had a coup of some sort, but you probably had a band of supporters, and that band of supporters was most likely your kin. And so, if for those of you who know the term of kin, kin is your family, and it doesn't have to necessarily always be biological, but typically it was a biologically driven group of family members who would act as your retainers, or whoever the ruler became their retainers, and they would fight for the ruler, and they would fight against other powers within their society or their civilization. Now, this poses a real problem. It's a problem, and something that we talk about in our country today is the smooth transfer of power. The smooth transfer of power is incredibly important for the success of a civilization, because if you're always having these giant civil wars every time a ruler dies, that does not help your economy. It doesn't help your education system. It doesn't help anything in terms of the development and the success and the security of your civilization. And so this strongman political rule, although it works very well in small scale, when I say very well, I mean, historically speaking, it was obviously a pretty predominant form of rule for a long time from the agricultural revolution on, but it did work. But it depended upon the king having kin or retainers who would fight for them. Now, the problem is this unsmooth transfer of power with constant civil wars. Every time a ruler dies and or a strong young leader comes up, you have massive shakeup and destabilization of your culture and your civilization. So Beowulf and the story of Beowulf starts to lay out the rules for retainers. And so this is, if you are a fighter for the king, I mean, what's the problem with having really strong fighters if you're a king? What might one of them want to do to you? Kill you. And if they kill you, what do they become? What does one of your retainers become? One of your retainers potentially becomes the king. And so you needed to tamp that down. And so any group of people who successfully mitigated a smooth transfer of power ended up becoming more successful. And so because they became more successful, they continually outperformed other groups within this kind of churning pot of the Dark Ages, because Rome had fallen, centralized power had fallen. There's all these decentralized powers rising up and causing all sorts of havoc everywhere, robbing, stealing, plundering, taking different political ownership or control of regions and areas. So slowly over time, with the help of the church, and the church at this point was not much. The church was not this big grand in the early part of the Dark Ages. The church was centered in Constantinople. It was no longer centered in Rome. It was way over in Turkey. And it didn't have a lot of regional control. But going all the way back to the Egyptians, we know that what makes for a very powerful government, and that is a theocracy. And what's a theocracy? Who can remember theocracy? Anybody? Theocracy is where your religion and your government are completely mixed and they're completely connected. And so, sorry, I meant to underline that. So, what did they do? The church came in and said a couple of things. And this wasn't an entirely new idea, just with the church influencing this, but it was an idea that led to this smooth transfer of power, is that we create hereditary monarchies. And so what does that mean? It means when a king dies, who does the power go to? His oldest son. If he doesn't have a son, who does it go to? His brother. If he doesn't have a brother, who does it go to? Maybe the spouse of his daughter. But it follows the family tree. And so it uses the same structure that's used over here for retainers and kinship or king structures, but it creates a hereditary connection that allows for that smooth transfer of power. Now, as this is unfolding, the church also is going to connect God and this notion of divine right. And so at the very top of the heap, you have God, and then you have the monarch. But here, because of this, the notion of theocracy is that the monarch becomes the direct conduit of God's will. Whatever the ruler is the ruler because God wills it. And that's why they're the ruler. And obviously, we know in our own political philosophy, which we'll get to later on at the very end of this course, but in American politics, and specifically as a byproduct of what happened during the Enlightenment, is that this connection philosophically by the founders of the United States became severed. They said, no, the king isn't the king because God wills it, and the president isn't the president because God wills it. It's the responsibility of each individual. And they were very Christianized, don't get me wrong, but it's the responsibility of the individual to select the best leader possible for their life and their situation and their culture. And therein lies the birth of democracy and the end of hereditary monarchy. And that's going to be the Enlightenment, really interesting philosophical period. But in this period, in this notion of divine right, if you go against, if you're a noble or a common person, also known as a serf, if you are a serf and you go against the rule or the wishes of the monarch, that is equitable with going against the word of God. And so what can the monarch do to his people? Anything he wants. Because anything that he does becomes, even if it's righteous or not righteous, becomes justifiable as the mini will of God. And that's divine right. Now, is divine right something that the American Revolution is going to want to kick to the curb? Absolutely. The American Revolution is all about ending divine right. But going back here, if we look at divine right and we look at hereditary monarchies, they are a hell of a lot smoother than strongman politics, because strongman politics always lead to some type of civil strife anytime there's a need for a transfer of power. Over here, we have a much smoother transfer of power than we did over here. And so divine right, love it or hate it, it comes with a lot of complexities. And interestingly, I love this period because the complexities of maintaining this political rule, divine right, is what's going to shape the art, dating, music, cathedral building. It is going to shape all of the things we're interested in this class, architecture, art, music, sculpture, even. Divine right is going to directly be responsible for shaping many of those things that are going to define medieval Europe. And so one of the first ones that you all are going to look at in this class, or you already did, was Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And this notion of how chivalry in honor of the retainer, a knight, because a retainer is basically going to become, after all of this becomes codified, all of this stuff becomes codified, a retainer will just transform into the idea of a knight. And they are the ones responsible for maintaining God's will of the monarch through divine right. I know there's lots of lines here and lots of drawings, but that's where knighthood comes from. So let's delve into this a little bit. Let's delve into chivalry, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and how political power is maintained in medieval Europe. So in a hereditary monarchy, you have a few things that become complicated. The first one that becomes really complicated is when your transfer of power is based upon hereditary lines. it all comes down to who sleeps with who. Because if she sleeps with him and they have a child together and he is of a prominent position, then that child becomes potentially within the hereditary line. Now we know, there's bastard children and there's all sorts of rules basically that dictate this because again, you want that smooth transfer of power, and so you got to have lots of rules that dictate how that power is transferred. So chastity, ironically, because of the political structure, chastity becomes of utmost importance. As interesting, they've done genetic tests on, they've exhumed bodies of British royalty, and they've found that a lot of British royalty who they thought was the son of so and so was actually not the son of so and so and was actually the son of somebody else, because now they can genetically test the bones and the remains of these bodies when they exhume them. And so it starts to create chastity. A woman's fidelity is of utmost importance because if a woman ends up sleeping with another man other than, let's say, the king, and then that child is born, presumed to be the child of the king, it gets tricky. Divine right gets screwed up. Is that the will of God? Is that not the will of God? Is that child really then going to be the king, even though they aren't the hereditary inheritor of the king's power? Very complicated. So you've got this going on. Then you have the next thing going on. So there's a quote that during the medieval period, all power passes through a woman's womb. And so chastity becomes, I can't stress enough, chastity becomes of utmost importance. So as chastity becomes important and as the control of a woman's womb becomes important for the transfer of power, we have obviously all marriages, or just about all marriages during this time period, at least amongst the ruling class, were arranged marriages. And so a wily king or a wily knight or a wily noble would bring all of the children of all of the important people in their kingdom to court. And this was a very common practice during the time. And so you bring them to court. And why do you bring them to court? Well, a couple of reasons. First reason is that if marriages and wombs control all political futures and you're the king and you're sitting, what do you want to do? You want to play marriage chess, and you want to marry people to particular people to form alliances, to maybe break up strong families who are becoming maybe a danger to your throne. If you can marry off their sons to families, to weaker families' daughters, then you can potentially start to break up their power and spread that power around. And so marriages became massively important to political control. And so if you were a wily king, what did you do? You said, hey, all my nobles and dukes and barons, your kids, they turn about 12 years old, they got to come to court. And what do? You have ladies in waiting, and you have young knights in training. And these young knights are going to become the king's retainers, the people who, through violence, maintain the king's powers. And they're going to be trained in fighting pretty from a very young age on up through. And as a result, when the king needs to call upon loyal subjects to retain his power to go to battle, he has a whole group of young men who he has raised from 10, 11, 12 years old in his house, who are the children of all of his nobles. as he's getting to know them and as he's watching the nobles, if any noble starts to act up, the king has the power to either give that child a bad marriage and or in some cases accidentally make that kid die. And all of a sudden hereditary goes out the window if the king can circumvent that hereditary arrangement. So marriage became massively important. And so as a result, as you all know from, middle school, high school, what happens when you take a bunch of unmarried young men and you take a bunch of unmarried young women and you put them in the same castle together, sometimes illegitimate babies are born or illegitimate things happen that threaten these arranged marriages. And by threatening the arranged marriages, you threaten hereditary monarchy and you threaten the entire political structure. So chastity, especially as we know it in the Western world, marriage is all connected back to this key idea. And it's all really historically about politics. So as a result, Andreas Complianos came up with a set of rules for courtly love. So courtly love, fascinating idea. Your marriage is going to be arranged, but you are certainly allowed to love outside of your marriage. But that love can never become physical. Never become physical. Abstinence, abstinence, abstinence has to stay as an idea. And so this is where the rules of courtly love come up. And we've got a couple videos on that you can read here. I also put a PDF in of them all. They're crazy. I think if you read these carefully and you consider how many middle schoolers and early high schoolers treat notions of dating and notions of propriety and notions of how one should act if they're wronged by their lover, those sorts of things. These are very oddly very modern while also being very old. One of them, I love this. Love is always a stranger in the home of avarice. And so you can't be, in other words, you can't be greedy. And so we all know, those, maybe you were the person or somebody who was the person or you were the recipient. Some 8th or 9th grade boy goes out and gets a job and he mows all those lawns and he saves up $120. And what does he immediately go do? He goes and immediately spends all $120 on his new girlfriend, who 3 weeks later breaks up with him. And he spent weeks or months coming up with that money. And so love is always a stranger in the home of avarice. It is not proper to love any woman whom one should be ashamed to seek to marry. This goes on. There's tons of them. Check them out. They're super fascinating. All right. So most of our contemporary rules for dating oddly come from hereditary politics. That is where we get a lot of it. So that's your lecture. Check out Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Check out the excerpts from Beowulf and contemplate, as always, where so many of our traditions come from our British history.